go beyond material measures that are offered by the National Protection Unit, such as bulletproof vest or bulletproof cars or bodyguards. This is not a way to mitigate the violence. We need a way to disactivate the violence, the structural violence, and instead of they don't need to invest that much money. They just need to generate the conditions to ensure the collective rights of the Black community in Colombia. And one of those proposals that we have is the respect for and implementation of prior consultation in the concept, in the framework of mega projects in Buenaventura. A new port mega project was approved. If you use the prior consultation as should be respected, understanding the cosmosvision of the people sitting down with us and not pushing us to the side, there would be a reduction of the risks, but the state is not interested in doing this. They're not looking at implementing measures that structurally reduce the risks for people who are essentially living in a battlefield. We ask to be allowed to have the life we deserve, to defend our people and the diversity of our country. When we're talking about territory, we're talking about the defense of human life, the Afro-Indigenous peoples who cohabitate in Colombia with the natural resources. These are resources that support life and well-being for us as a community and for the entire country and world. Thank you. Thank you, Daneje and Adriana. I'd like to share just a few conclusions from these two interventions. First, to highlight the need to have a participation from the communities, as was mentioned by Daneje and Adriana, in all the measures that have to do with the guarantees for the protection of the defense of human rights. So with that, we can go back to the petition or the call that Adriana made that has to do with carrying out monitoring and implementing the mechanisms that were already agreed upon with the national government to end the attacks against human rights defenders. In addition to what Daneje mentioned, of not only analyzing risk factors coming from the presence of illegal armed groups, but also the presence of illicit economies that open a space for these kinds of risks for the defense of human rights. Obviously, there's also a need to guarantee factors that make it possible for community participation. For example, the fundamental right to participate in prior consultation for Afro and Indigenous communities. Now we're going to have a more international space, so we're going to open the microphone for Ana Maria Rodriguez and to ask her what have been the recommendations of the Colombian Commission of Jurists. What are the recommendations that have been made by different international entities in relation to the protection of human rights defenders and the balance in general in relation to this issue? Thank you so much, Camila. So I want to start by saying that unfortunately what Adriana and Daneje are talking about today is issues they're not new issues in Colombia. They're not new issue for those people who carry out the defense of human rights. And both of them referred to violence against people who defend rights and that this is a historic problem. The Colombian Commission of Jurists has been doing research over the last few months to look at the recommendations from different UN entities in relation to our country to improve the situation over the last 5 years. And what we've been able to ratify is that we're talking about the same issues, and these are recommendations that are repeated again and again. And due to the insufficient implementation, this means that the problem continues. I would like to share, and give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen with you all. I hope you can all see this. But to talk a little bit about the preliminary conclusions from the research that we are wrapping up.
Entonces, comenzaría por...
So I'd like to start by talking about the situation and the general balance of the risk of defenders of the last few years. So I'm going to go over these very quickly, but I just want to show you, from the database of sociopolitical violence that we have in our organization, we have found that over the 5 years that we studied, there were 1,062 cases of violations of the right to life and integrity of human rights defenders and social leaders in Colombia, where the largest percentage of the violence and violations of the right to life is against men, although there is 14%, a significant percentage of women victims. We've been able to see that over the 5 years, the departments that have the highest rate of violence are departments that coincide with areas where the armed conflict has had the greatest impact and where there have been demobilizations and the FARC has handed over its weapons. So you can see these statistics here in this slide in relation to the violation of the right to life and physical integrity. So here, and to complement the prior graph, we see in the different colors, it shows the intensity in relation to the number of homicides. And maybe even more concerning is, which are darkest. What's most concerning is that essentially all of the country is colored, except for San Andres and Providencia and Guainía, Valpes, and Amazonas. All the rest of the country is colored, and this shows that it's not an isolated violence. That's something that's happening in just a few municipalities or a few departments. This has a systematic nature and is taking place essentially throughout the entire country. In relation to the frequency and the continuity of violations against the right to life, what we found between 2016 and 2020 was an increasing trend in the number of murders. For 2016, we have a low number with 101 murders. This is, low in the, scandalous numbers that are Colombia, 101 human rights defenders, but this has increased each year. And we see for 2020, it was 321 human rights defenders who were murdered.
Despacio porque
So,
recoge...
this graph has a lot of information because it reflects the different, population groups of social leaders and defenders who have been murdered. I just want to highlight a couple, and this is indigenous and community leaders and peasant or small-scale workers are the largest part of this pie, although there are obviously other sectors who also face high levels of victimization. In relation to the alleged authors or responsible parties behind these aggressions, what we have found is that the majority of the cases have an unidentified author, and after, in the order, it's paramilitary groups or unidentified armed groups. This is the second group of the alleged authors, which is then followed by the FARC, or what are called the FARC dissident groups, other civilian groups, and this is then followed by the National Liberation Army, the National Army, the National Police, and then the Popular Liberation Army. And last, there was one case that was allegedly responsibility of the FARC-EP. And so this shows the diversity and the multiplication of armed groups over the last 5 years since the signing of the peace agreement, and the lack of effective actions both to dismantle these groups as well as the clarification of the events when there are unidentified authors behind these murders. Then in relation to where the murders are taking place, or in reference to human rights defenders, this graph shows that even though there is a high percentage of cases where there's not information where the events took place, it's very concerning that almost half of the murders took place in the defender's home or near their home. And so just to have an idea on the level of violence violence against human rights defenders over the last 5 years. So now I want to focus on the international recommendations. So between 2016 and 2020, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee Against Forced Disappearance, the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Committee for the Elimination of All Kinds of Violence Against Women, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, together with a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights, and the different countries who are part of the Human Rights Council in the context of the periodic review, and have examined Colombia and have have made recommendations in relation to human rights defenders. So we're able to identify 53 recommendations, and to be able to analyze and study their fulfillment, what we did was to organize them in 4 categories or thematic blocks, which are respect, prevention, protection, and guarantees of non-recurrence, and the rights of defenders. And so each of these 4 categories was then divided in some subcategories that were more specific, that allowed us to evaluate the fulfillment of each of the recommendations. So the assessment that we carried out on the implementation level for each of the subcategories is rated as low, or partial, or mid-level, which means there are some actions but not sufficient to consider the recommendation to have been fulfilled, or a high level when we're talking that the recommendation is completely fulfilled, or there are sufficient actions to say that there's adequate fulfillment of that recommendation. So on average, the evaluation of these subcategories led to an analysis, a general analysis of the category. I know it sounds a little confusing. Hopefully you'll be more clear further along in the presentation. So what are preliminary conclusions of analyzing these 53 recommendations that were made between 2016 and 2020? First, that there's an important level of general recommendations. This means it's difficult to carry out a follow-up or to evaluate the implementation, because if the recommendation is very ambiguous or general, it's not easy to know whether specific concrete actions that should be taken out to see if or not it has been fulfilled. Second, and I think that's something that reflects what I mentioned at the beginning, that there's a high level of repeated recommendations. This means that on the one hand, that the main violations and characteristics of the violence against defenders has been maintained over time, or so that problems have not been resolved, they continue. And second, that the interest and attention of the International Committee has been focused in these issues that continue to be the same and most concerning issues over time. Third, and this has to do with the first point, is that we see that the same recommendation can have elements from different thematic categories at the same time. One recommendation could talk about prevention, it could talk about protection, and legal investigations, all in the same recommendation. And again, it makes it difficult to measure the implementation level. So in some ways, we had to kind of pull apart these different components to be able to evaluate and their implementation level depending on the different categories that were established. So in relation to the number of recommendations per category, we found that about half of the recommendations that were made are related to with prevention, and almost the other half are equally distributed among respect, protection, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And the majority of these last points have to do with recommendations of investigations of acts of violence. So the fifth conclusion that we found is that the topics that were most repeated over the last 5 years had to do with strengthening the protection, ensuring budget, improving response times, ensuring the participation of human rights defenders in the definition of the different measures. Also, the issue that has to do with the incorporation of a differential perspective in both risk analysis and also the definition of protection measures provided to the individuals. And another issue was the specific protection measures for defenders who live in rural areas, as well as the adoption of collective protection measures. And then we see awareness raising campaigns in relation to acknowledging the important work of human rights defenders. This is followed by measures to respond to stigmatization and the need to respond to these attacks when they come from judicial operators, as well as the incorporation of differential perspectives in the investigation of crimes against these people. Another general conclusion is that there's a more implementation in the recommendations that are focused on the international community, civil society, or the human rights ombudsperson's office, and there's lower implementation in recommendations that are focused on the government and judicial authorities. A seventh conclusion is that the fulfillment level in general by the Colombian state is more formal than material. Specifically, in those recommendations where we see a mid-level fulfillment, we have found that this is because there have been maybe standards that have been created but it's not applied, or there's coordination spaces or committees that are created but they don't have meetings, or they announce there'll be plans or programs that are never put into practice. And so we believe that something has been done but not sufficient to actually fulfill that recommendation. Another conclusion has to do with in the issues where we see the highest level of advancements. I've kind of gone over time, so I'm not going to go into too many details, but the last conclusion we have has to do with the state of implementation. And I'd like to highlight that in relation to respect, we see mostly a mid-level implementation. In relation to prevention, there are a few points where there are advances. Other, we see mid-level actions, and there are others where very little has been done. And this means that on average, the fulfillment level is low. In relation to protection, the fulfillment level is mid-level, because even though there is a major debt in relation to collective protection for Afro-Colombian indigenous communities, in relation to protection in general, and the incorporation of a differential perspective, there are advances that leads us to a mid-level fulfillment. And lastly, in relation to the guarantees of non-recurrence, we see that there's a negative implementation where there's a low-level implementation, both for the fight against impunity and the abuse of state intelligence. We see that the number of actions carried out by the state are very low to fulfill the recommendations that have been formulated. And I'm going to conclude here. I just want to conclude by saying over the next few weeks, we hope to publish the full document with the full analysis, and we hope you'll be able to read this full document. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you, Ana Maria. And so just to conclude, I think it's important to take into account from her intervention that it's unfortunate that the situation continues to be very grave and that the implementation of international recommendations in relation to the protection, respect, prevention, and guarantees of non-repetition for human rights defenders still has a very low level of implementation. And we hope that Colombia will really work hard to implement and fully implement the recommendations that are formulated by the United Nations. So to close, so maybe in your just very quickly 2-minute response, for you, what would be the actions that could be carried out by the international community to improve the situation of human rights defenders in Colombia? We've already heard a couple comments, but I'd like you all to respond specifically to this question. I'm not sure who would like to answer.
Ana María, ¿tú te animas?
Ana Maria, do you want to start? I already talked a lot. I just want to say that it's important that you request that Colombia has a monitoring mechanism for the recommendations, which is transparent and participatory, and that it allows for accountability that's more clear and detailed to be able to have a more detailed information on the implementation and how that is advancing. Okay, then I will open up the space for some questions from the public. There is one question for Reneji that says, in the case of Buenaventura, what actions do the state entities carry out, or do they just not do anything at all? Reneji.
Parece que hemos perdido la conexión con Taneli.
No, looks like we've lost our connection with Reneji. Okay, so I'll move forward with another question. It says, you believe that given the grave and systematic nature of the assassination of human rights defenders, social leaders, and demobilized ex-combatants, do you think it would be important to have an investigation from the Human Rights Council? As Colombia has the highest number of murdered human rights defenders, would that be a way to focus the Council's attention on Colombia?
No sé quién se anime a hablar, no sé si Adriana, Ana María.
Would like to respond, Adriana, Ana Maria? Do either of you like to respond?
Bueno, yo.
It looks like it's my turn again. Okay. I'm not sure how realist it would be that there'll be a specific investigation mechanism for the Colombian case from the council. I think with the current context, it would be very difficult for this to happen. However, if it were possible, it would be very interesting to, be able to really having a specific focus from the international community that's looking at what's happening in our country. I think it could be more effective that the different countries carry out more detailed and demanding follow-up on the fulfillment of the recommendations that they make, so that the government can make it feel the pressure that these recommendations aren't just words, but they're actually be monitoring on the implementation of these recommendations. Thank you so much. Okay, so the last question says, what monitoring spaces on the implementation of these recommendations exist? Are there sanctions if the Colombian government ignores these recommendations?
Sigo respondiendo yo mientras.
Okay, I guess I'll go again. So I think the recommendations are part of the international commitments, from all the countries, including Colombia, in the concept of, good faith. But there is no mechanism that obligates a fulfillment of the recommendations. You can assume that by, signing the international human rights treaties, the Colombian state does have a commitment to fulfill all these standards, and the recommendations as the way to have a periodic updating of what is, considered, what the state needs to improve to fulfill that implementation. But there is not any mechanism that is, obligates an implementation, or there aren't any specific negative consequences that come from non-compliance beyond, questioning the legitimacy or the good name of the country due to its, lack of commitment to human rights.
Muchas gracias, Ana María.
Thank you, Ana Maria.
Entonces, nada, pues muchísimas gracias
Okay, well,
por las
thank you.
respuestas.
Thank you all for your
Y
responses.
pues nuevamente muchas gracias a todos.
And once again, thank you to all the people who are watching us, both from Colombia and from Europe. Thank you for being with us today. We'll remind you that the report, the balance on the implementation of international recommendations, will be published shortly by the CCJ, and we'll be communicating through our social media when that report will be launched. And so we'll be communicating this information, and we also open the invitation to all of you to be, to read the report that will be published today by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Offenders. And before I finalize, I just got another question for Adriana. Sorry. And it says, what can you do to reduce the risks for environmental defenders in Santander? Adriana, can you answer that question before we close? Hello? Hello? Yep, we can hear you. Can you repeat the question, please? The question is, what can be done to reduce the risks for environmental defenders in Santander?
¿Qué se puede hacer?
What can be done? Well, activate the mechanisms that have already been established in the context of, for people who carry out the defense of human rights. They have generate true protection, so as our colleague Neja mentioned, the measures from the UNP, from the protection unit, are not sufficient, but we need to have a true implementation of prevention and protection for defenders, whether they're environmental defenders or any other kind of defenders. Thank you, Adriana. Okay, so we invite all of the people to consult our different documents that can be used for advocacy in the defense, around the defense of human rights. We have written these documents were developed by the International Advocacy Area of the CCJ, and these is the new tools that can be used to carry out advocacy and to favor the protection of human rights defenders. So we'd like to thank our interpreter as well, who has been with us during the session today. Also, the CCJ team that has facilitated this event, and all the panelists and everyone who has joined us today. So we also like to thank Peace Brigades International Colombia, PBI, the International Network of Human Rights, RADH, and OIDACO for making this event possible, and obviously also the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Colombia. Thank you all.